hit record. Excellent. Thank you. Welcome to our Land Steward Program Community Education Series. The OSU Land Steward Program is in Jackson County, Oregon at the SOREC, the Southern Oregon Research and Extension Services. Research and Education Services, Extension. Always get those two mixed up. And my name is Nicole Smith. I'm the Land Steward Education Program Assistant. And right now it is just me in the Land Steward Program. Rachel Whirling, our Land Steward Coordinator, departed for other pastures. And so I'm bridging the gap between coordinators helping with the volunteer and the education programs. To hear about any upcoming classes, if you haven't already been subscribed and gotten our MailChimp, which is probably where you might have heard about this class, you can go to our website. If you just Google OSU Land Steward Program, it'll pull up. This is one of the first links that comes up, and you'll see a subscribe program in the Land Steward Program tab. If you go down to the events tab, you can see upcoming events. For example, we have one on the 23rd. Oops. On the 23rd, Rachel will be presenting fire-reluctant native plants for Firewise Landscaping. And then there are also other events through OSU that are listed. There's a native seed stratification on October 10th coming up. And I believe that's at the extension. So if you click on those orange links online, you have more information about those upcoming events. But today we are here for Agroforestry, Forest Farming, and Native Forest Crops, an introduction by Dr. Eric Burkhart. Dr. Eric Burkhart is a botanist, ethnobotanist, and agroforester at Penn State University, where he is a teaching professor in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Management. He holds degrees in ethnobotany, BS, from Idaho State University, horticulture, MS, from Penn State, and forest resources, PhD, from Penn State. For the past 2 decades, he has been working on topics pertaining to forest-based in situ stewardship and agroforestry crop development of the Appalachian non-timber forest products, NTFPs. In recent years, he's also been working in Central America, Belize and Costa Rica, and the Caribbean, the US Virgin Islands, on agroforestry and ethnobotany projects. Thank you, Eric, so much for joining us, and we're very much looking forward to your presentation. I am going to stop sharing my screen so that you can start sharing yours.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me this evening. It's a pleasure to be here from the East Coast, joining you on Pennsylvania time. It's a little after 9 o'clock, so you'll have to forgive me if I sound a little bit lazy. It's the end of the day here. But once I get going, I'll start to get some energy and share a little bit with you here this evening about this practice that we call forest farming. If you're interested in some of what I work on, I do have an Instagram page that I'm listing there, PSU Botany and Ethnobotany, if anybody's interested. And on Instagram, we do post a lot of kind of updates about forest farming, agroforestry, and just plants in general. I'm also a teaching professor here at Penn State, as was just mentioned, and my program focuses largely on this practice that we're going to be talking about tonight, forest farming, and a lot of the different things that people want to grow or forage for, and how we can kind of integrate or thread together a variety of different ideas around foraging, managing lands, and doing things like conservation and providing food and fiber and medicine for friends and family and so on. So with that, I'll jump right in and just say that each year we hold a series of forest farming webinars here through Penn State Extension. And so if folks are interested in anything that you hear tonight, these are generally free and available. We'll be announcing next year's typically in January or February. But we do have one last one coming up if people are interested. This upcoming November, I'll be talking about some of the considerations around economics and marketing of things that one might want to produce on forest farms. And I'll be joined by a couple of my colleagues, one from the National Agroforestry Center, which I'll share more about in just a moment, and another colleague that works in basically southwestern Virginia with agroforestry program there with Appalachian Sustainable Development. So we'll have a variety of different perspectives talking about considerations around the economics and marketing of some of these products, including some that we'll talk about this evening. So I'm going to start with kind of the broad view, and then we're going to kind of get into a little bit more detailed view around forest farming and what it is. And then what I'm going to do is walk through 3 different crops this evening. I'm also going to talk a little bit about syrup production in the context of one of them. But these crops are going to be decidedly, East Coast forest focused. That's where I do most of my work. But I want to assure you that a lot of the information and a lot of the kind of anecdotes and experience and research caveats that I share with you are broadly applicable. So my idea here is to inspire you and to give you some things to think about as you think about how this practice might fit into any landscape that you're part of. And so I encourage you to, first of all, recognize that this set of agroforestry practices is a nationally promoted set of practices. There are 5 practices. I'll mention more about this in a moment. Nationally, many of them are cost shared or have some sort of funding that's attached to them through NRCS and other agencies. So, there's a lot of opportunities to kind of do interesting things with woody perennials in the landscape. And that's essentially what we're talking about when we talk about agroforestry, is this idea of intentionally planting longer term woody perennials in strategic arrangements, right, and places in the landscape. So the Agroforestry Center that I'm putting up the webpage, landing page for here, is a great resource if you're not already familiar with it, with a variety of different information and links. The 5 practices that are promoted across the United States, perhaps some of you are familiar with all of them already, or some of them. We'll be talking about forest farming, of course, this evening, but we have things that maybe are more widespread, at least in people's minds, things like windbreaks, for example, riparian forest buffers, so vegetation next to waterways, alley cropping, which is, essentially intercropping with woody plants, and this idea of silvopasture, which is integrating livestock within pastures and woody components to that as well. So a lot of interesting and, another hour and a half worthy kind of webinar for each of these practices at least. But we'll talk about forest farming tonight. And as we talk about forest farming and any of these agroforestry practices, the one thing I just want to share with you is that it all comes down to thinking it through. So, for something like forest farming, as we're going to talk more about the next hour or so, there are so many different ways that this could be done. And as I just said, the crops that I'm going to be sharing are crops that are widely utilized here in the Eastern United States, but aren't necessarily native to your woodlands in the Pacific Northwest. But there are other species that can stand in and fit that kind of niche, if you will. So the main thing we want to get are some of the principles. These 4 I's, as we call them, are some of the principles we want to think about. Agroforestry, including forest farming, is really about the intentionality of what we're doing. And by that, I mean it's not just about going out and exploiting foraging for wild resources wherever they might occur and just removing them, but there's an intentionality to what we're doing out there, to the practice that we're bringing to the landscape. We're integrating. So, the woody plants that we're thinking about in the overstory, for example, in a forest farm, we're also thinking about the understory. So it's very much a holistic kind of bent of forestry, if you will, where we are really not just managing for the timber, but for things in the understory and midstory that we might be interested in as well. It is de facto, because of the things I just said, a little bit more intensive than typical land management, especially mowing a lawn, for example, which by intensive, I mean, putting your brain power to it, maybe having to go out and do some really hands-on labor because of the type of practice that you're doing doesn't lend itself well to mechanization, that sort of thing. So it can be intensive just because you're trying to stack functions, if you will, in the landscape. And ideally, it's going to be interactive, so the system works well together. We're not sacrificing the forest for the understory crops, right? And vice versa. So we're trying to manage for biodiversity in place, in situ, if you will. So just something to think about. We call that the four eyes. And I would argue maybe that intentionality is really where it all begins. So this practice of forest farming, there are a number of definitions out there, but they all kind of come down to my own definition here, which is essentially we're using things that are already in a forest or things that would grow well on our forested site. We're putting those in the understory in a strategic way, and we're managing for them. But it doesn't just stop there. It's not just horticulture in the understory. As I just mentioned, we're also thinking about the overstory. So there's very much a forest management component to this, as there is in many agroforestry practices. And so one of the things perhaps many of you are already aware of is that, it can get very overwhelming to try and wrap your brain around all the things that happen on a forest land and how to manage it, manage for all of the different species and interactions that are occurring. I just encourage you to try and not feel overwhelmed. And tonight I'm going to kind of help walk you through some of the thought process associated with forest farming and multi-species management. But recognize also that there's a lot of resources out there, service foresters, consulting foresters, and others that can provide a lot of resources to you as you work through getting to know your forest and how to manage it. When we talk about these agroforestry practices, forest farming is somewhat singular because as this illustration from a very user-friendly book called Farming the Woods by some of my colleagues, Ken Mudge and Steve Gabriel here out in New York. This is available basically anywhere at this time, but this is one of the figures that comes from it. And one of the things that it illustrates is when you look at the directionality of the arrows, we're talking about closed canopy to open conditions. And so with many agroforestry practices, what this is illustrating, for example, riparian buffers, alley propping, and windbreaks, we are simply talking about taking woody perennial materials and sticking them in the landscape and closing that landscape up a little bit. When we talk about forest farming and silvopastures to some degree, that's beyond the scope of tonight's conversation, but certainly forest farming, we're often talking about a closed canopy. So we're starting with a land that already has a forest on it, and we're thinking about how we're going to manage that forest from the canopy down. Right, so there is some management of trees and of woody vegetation, of course, but we're not starting with an open condition, generally speaking, when we talk about forest farming. I also have circled here at the bottom forest gardening. I won't spend too much time just belaboring this, but there's a lot of kind of overlapping terminology that one can come across out there in the literature, especially if you're familiar with permaculture. And some of it comes down to terms like forest gardens or food forests. And a lot of these practices start with open conditions with the intention of developing a forest on a site. So that's kind of the distinction, if there needs to be one, between forest gardens, food forests, and forest farming. So tonight what we'll be talking about is when you start with an existing forest and you're managing for species. All of these types of management principles and agroforestry in general operate along this idea that we're thinking about the vertical integration as well as the horizontal integration of species. And so that's why, again, the complexity and the intensity of things gets rather quickly overwhelming for a lot of people. And so one of the reasons why agroforestry, is not as widespread as some might hope that it is in the United States is just because, it is adding more things to people's kind of docket of things to weed, of things to manage, of, crops that have to be matched together and so on. So people just like to, manage for simplicity in many cases. But this is absolutely, if you're passionate about growing plants and getting your hands dirty and that sort of thing, This vertical integration and thinking about how much you can grow on as little space as possible is absolutely a big part of what we're talking about tonight. And this can be, on a quarter acre, or it can be multiple acres. So forest farms have a variety of different scalabilities to them, depending on how intensive they are and the crops that you're thinking about managing. One of the reasons that we are interested in forest farms and the forest canopy is because it provides the shade that we are desiring for one reason or another. And so let me just break it down like this. If we were going to grow something that requires a lot of sunlight, we would probably opt for, as I just mentioned, things like a forest garden where we're growing something in the open and we're going to let that canopy maybe close over time, or we're going to prune it so that it stays semi-open, right? So we get sunlight on it. A lot of trees that don't, and woody vegetation that don't like shade will not perform very well in the shade, right? So it's kind of self-defeating that we would try and grow things that are shade intolerant in the forest. We're just, not getting production and probably wasting a bunch of plant material. So we want to think about what that forest canopy can provide. Many of the crops, therefore, are picked out because they actually are shade, not just tolerant, but obligate. That is, they only grow in the shade, or at least part shade for part of their life cycle. Or they grow in association with things like trees. We'll talk about that with mushrooms, for example. And so we want to think about, yes, you could grow anything in a forest farm, but what makes sense, right? And the things that tend to make sense are things that are found in the shade. And a lot of these things fall into a category of what we call non-timber forest products, sometimes called specialty forest products. These are things that come from the forest that aren't necessarily wood, or should we say saw timber. Sometimes people lump in things like walking sticks and so on into this category. And there are generally four broad categories. We're going to kind of talk about several of them tonight, not all of them. We'll focus our attention on the medicinal and edible tonight, but recognize that, for example, salal in the West Coast in your area is something that actually is harvested from that region in an extensive way for the floral and craft trades. And so wherever you go in North America, there are products that are being harvested from the forest, sword ferns, for example, for the fronds to put into floral arrangements. And these can be managed, right? And so non-timber forest products can be just simply exploited, but the idea of forest farming is that we're going to go further than that. We're going to start stewarding these things and perhaps managing them. Okay. It's, as I mentioned, scalable. So one can start on a small amount of acreage. It could be a backyard kind of scenario like we see here, small woodlot that doesn't really have anything that's a merchantable size anyway as far as timber goes. So in other words, many people find that forest farming works very well when you simply don't have anything that you really want to harvest in any near future, right? And so in this case, we've got some misshapen trees, we've got a lot of young spindly growth, and not a whole lot going on out there, right? But this is perfect for growing plants in the understory, right? Or vines or overstory trees that you might want to gather fruit and things from. And there are a variety of ways that we can go about this. I'm going to illustrate some of this tonight, but the short story is we can start doing some thinning of the understory, getting it more towards a horticultural kind of scenario where we are clearing out some of the undesirable underbrush. Typically, that doesn't mean we're reducing the native biodiversity in the area. It does mean that we're managing it. And certainly if there are invasive species present, we may be removing those. And that's exactly what is happening here. And that's why everything is opened up so much. This is an early seeded ginseng plot. And in this case, it was all invasive honeysuckle, multiflora rose shrubs. And this is the ginseng, same area in a later stage of development. And these are all ginseng plants in the understory. And so in some ways, we think about forest farming in the name farming, and it connotes that we're going to be doing something that is rather intensive. And that's exactly what we see here, where we're kind of modifying the understory, It is a native plant, by the way, and it was a non-native community, so we've actually modified it in a better direction. But we have turned it into a bit of a monoculture of a single species in the understory, right? And so we're going to talk about that theme in the remainder of this presentation as, is that a desirable thing that we want to do? Furthermore, we can go even one further step and we can start to build things like beds, right? Horticultural beds. So here is ginseng again being grown in beds. These things can lend themselves to very rapid plant growth in many cases if we're trying to grow a particular species, in this case, a root, and it makes it easier to harvest and so on. So there's reasons that we may want to go this step. But there are a variety of different ways that we can do forest farming. It need all not be farming per se. Okay. The thing we want to think about though is that understory can go a variety of different directions, right? And intensities. So goes the overstory. So, we don't have a ton of time tonight to really get into the principles of silviculture and managing trees. And, the composition of the trees is going to influence a lot of the management protocol anyway. But just as a general principle, as we think through a little bit of that management, on the left side of this, the species composition that starts out in a stand early on may not be the same composition and certainly dominance of the species that are there later, right? That might seem self-evident, but we call that process succession, right? And that happens in forest lands. The scale and the timing of that succession differs, of course. You all are in the Pacific Northwest and you're dealing with some old growth forests, for example, with Douglas fir and Western red cedar. Here in the Eastern United States, we're dealing with Eastern hemlocks, and that might be 500 or 800-year cycle on those stands. So, the scale of it, the timing of it is sometimes less than 100 years, sometimes more than that. But things change over time. And just as we're doing in the understory and managing those populations of interest, we're also managing the overstory. And so a lot of that is going to take, the approach of silvicultural kinds of techniques, right? We'll talk about a few of those. One of those techniques is simply thinning stands. So, timber stand improvements is a fancy term, TSIs, for things that we do to our stand that are intermediate in the development that help to improve the quality and the composition of the stand. And in this case, this is a shiitake mushroom log operation from south central Pennsylvania, about an hour south of here. And this landowner was thinning some of the overtopped oak and using the oak logs then to produce shiitakes. Those shiitake logs then being raised in the forest and using the forest then as kind of like a, incubator, if you will, for the mushroom logs. Okay, here's an example from Western North Carolina, which was recently hit, of course, as you all know, by a hurricane. There's a lot of different things that we can do with the biomass that we get doing these types of management approaches. And I just kind of want to, as we get into looking at these crop examples, get you thinking about some of the different things we want to consider. And it's not just about overstory management or understory, it's about the integration of both and thinking about how we can best use the products that come from this management. Okay. In this case, these are shiitakes, as I mentioned, and landowners producing them for local farmers markets. Now, as we get ready to just kind of walk through in the remaining presentation, some cropping options, some examples from the East Coast, and some of the associated kinds of experiences and considerations. I want to just kind of orient you within this idea of forest farming. I had already mentioned the idea of farm kind of suggests that we're converting the forest understory over to something, and I showed you some pictures of that. But I want you to recognize that most of the forest farmers that I deal with, for example, here in Pennsylvania, in the Mid-Atlantic region, the Eastern United States, don't grow as intensively as what you saw in those photos. Most of the people that are actually doing forest farming are doing something more towards the center or left side of what I call this continuum or spectrum of possibilities. The pictures that I showed you were more towards the right side, where we call it woods cultivation, for example, or woods grown. This is the idea that we're going to really do a lot of intensive horticulture or even mycology in the understory of that forest, and it's going to have a very kind of obvious presence there, right? And on the left side, we see the opposite of that, wild stewardship. This is the idea that we're out there foraging, yes, but we're not just exploiting populations. We're actually manipulating those populations. We're managing those populations. We're increasing their numbers by spreading propagules around and all that sort of thing. Okay, and so fundamental to that kind of approach is just learning how to care for the plants, right? And reseeding or dividing them and that sort of thing. And then what we often see, what I often see in forest farming is the middle ground approach, if you will. A lot of the time it's dubbed the wild simulated approach. This is an approach where people will blend a little bit, the best of both worlds, right? So you may be growing something, it looks pretty wild, generally speaking, in that forest. That crop is looking pretty wild, but it is every bit intentional, right? And you are managing it in many cases an intensive way, even though it may not look like it. It's just a different type of management and focus. So the low-hanging fruit to forest farming is always to kind of look at your forest lands and see what is growing there, and to start on the left side of that continuum and perhaps think about how far along that continuum you want to go and what makes sense. So it all starts with recognizing what grows on your forest lands, what's doing very well there, how you can manage those populations, how they can be utilized either personally or commercially, and thinking about how you can expand them ultimately, as if you're planting more and more acreage of corn or any other cash crop. And again, how you expand it, how rapidly is up to you. And so in many cases, forest farming is really about, as I mentioned at the beginning, intentionality first, and then you can build up to some of the other I's, such as the intensiveness. So let me walk you through some examples. I'm going to start out with a mushroom crop example. I'd already mentioned shiitakes. Shiitakes are what we would call saprophyte or saprophytic mushroom, which means that they grow on detritus or decomposing organic matter. And so when we think about forest farming, it is possible to do these thinnings or improvements and use the biomass for that type of production with oyster mushrooms and shiitakes and so on. But there's also another approach, and I thought I would highlight that one here, which is the approach of managing mushroom crops in situ. And by that, I mean the mushrooms that are already there that might actually be mycorrhizal mushrooms, for example. So I'll use yellow morel as the example. You all have morels, I know, out there in the Pacific Northwest. And I think at the beginning it was shared that my undergraduate is from Idaho. I know when we were out in Idaho, we'd always head up to the aspens or the populus, the cottonwood groves, and look for the morels. And so, morels have an interesting life cycle. I'll just share briefly some insight into that in just a moment. But we recognize that they are a desirable edible fungus with some burgeoning commercial appeal. In many parts of the United States, there are pretty well-developed markets that lead into many urban areas, including here in Pennsylvania. Mushroom gathering, and morels in particular, is a widespread cultural activity here in Pennsylvania in the eastern United States, just like it is in the western United States. There is certainly nothing wrong with it as a foraging practice, as a way to get out and enjoy the landscape and get to know things that are around you. But when we talk about the need for forest farming, we talk about if people are interested in getting more morels and maintaining populations of morels that are out on forest lands, that's within the realm of forest farming. So the idea here is that we're going beyond just going out and finding the morels, but we're trying to actively do things that encourage the morels to persist and or spread within the landscape. Okay? And to do this, we have to understand a little bit about the biology and ecology of each species. And so, as I mentioned, the first step in forest farming is to get to know what's growing on your forest. And the second thing is to start to get to know the life cycle and the ecology of things that you're interested in. In the case of morels, morels have a rather complicated life cycle. If you all are not familiar with this pub, maybe many of you are, it actually came from Oregon. It's a fantastic pub that you can Google and find on the web. And this graph comes from it, and I'll simplify it and just point out several key things here. Mushrooms, first of all, grow from spores, and they develop a, let's call it a vegetative body. For simplicity, that's called a mycelium. That mycelium is the part that kind of spreads throughout the environment, right? Whether it's or a decomposing log or on the root system of a tree. If it's on the root system of a tree, we call it a mycorrhizal mushroom. And if it is just something that is found on a decomposing log or just breaks down organic matter, we call it a saprobic mushroom, okay? So the idea here is that when you look at a morel mushroom, they can actually go through several different kinds of pathways of how they get around the landscape. So one of those pathways is that they do actually just decompose things. They're opportunistic. They kind of come in on decomposing matter, wood chips and so on, and they'll grow there and maybe they'll persist for a few years and then be gone. In other cases, as in the middle box here, the live tree ectomycorrhizae, these mushrooms can grow on the root system in association with particular tree species. I mentioned aspens and populus species a moment ago in Idaho. And still in other cases, we can get these kinds of really odd occurrences where they just pop up, for example, following fires as dormant sclerotia. So essentially, these are like these kind of dormant stages that the mushrooms go through, the mycelial muff goes through, and then they just pop out of this dormancy following the right conditions. So, you know, the thing to take away is that morels are tricky, and that's what makes them difficult to grow in many cases and predictably grow. But we can manage for them. We do know some of the ecology, and I've just outlined it. So, for example, one of the things we can do is just manage for the trees that are host to the morel mushrooms that might be on our forest land. Now, this could also be something like matsutake growing in association with the Douglas fir, or chanterelles growing in association with other trees, right? So, you know, thinking about if it's a mycorrhizal mushroom, how do we manage that forest to get more of that mushroom? Okay, here in the eastern United States, morels, yellow morels in particular, we see an association with a lot of elm, American elm in particular, dead and dying American elm as well as living elm. Um, you know, when we go out and look around the base of the elms, then we can find that in the springtime, lots of fruiting bodies are coming up, right, off of that mycelium that has developed a relationship on the root system. Okay, and other trees that also support, just for example, here in the east include something like a tulip poplar. Okay, here we see yellow morels coming up on a very small tulip poplar, which is off to the right, just outside of an urban situation, right? So these mushrooms can actually grow in association with these trees at a very early stage of development, right? We can inoculate things, and people are, for example, truffles on oak trees. So you can buy morel spawn out there. It's available, right? Companies do sell it. Whether you can get it to grow or not is hit or miss, and it's quite expensive. But you also have a morel resource that's on your forest land potentially. So one of the things we want to think about in forest farming is, you know, how we take that resource and turn it into propagule, for example. So simple practices that we can do that fall into the realm of stewardship and foraging would be things like when you gather the mushrooms, making sure that you are, you know, using bags that have the potential to shed any spores that might be dry enough in those ascocarps to come out. You know, there's controversy about whether that works or not. I'm not here to address it tonight, but you know, just simple practices to make sure that we're getting the spores out into that local environment when you're out there harvesting. Okay, leaving behind some of the ones that are already a little bit far gone, right? That mushroom cap right there has spores in it. And so taking that propagule and leaving it behind or burying it near to nearby trees that are potential hosts for the species. That is the intentional part, again, associated with agroforestry and forest farming. Okay, if we go a step further, we can take the caps and use them in a morel. We can take the stems and caps and use them. And we're left with the stump, if you will. And that stump actually has a mycelial muff on it. So that white fuzzy stuff that you see there is the vegetative body. And there is potential, and I can't guarantee that it works for you, given whatever you collect and the circumstances that you experience. But there is the potential to do these low-tech kind of propagation techniques that you can read more about and see YouTube videos around, which is, getting the mycelium to jump onto wet cardboard, for example. And in this case, this is a successful jump, if you will, where the caps are just kind of rolled up in this wet cardboard. The cardboard is incubated in some plastic in a warm environment. And once you see the mycelium on the cardboard starting to decompose that cardboard, or just really starting to move on it, those pieces of cardboard can be cut into smaller strips and then potentially planted near host trees, right? None of this assures success, right? Morels are tricky, but the idea and the principle is that we're trying to steward it so that we can get more of it out there, and we're paying attention to the ecology of it, where it wants to grow and who it wants to grow with, and the biology of it, how we might propagate it, and trying to make steps towards getting it out there, right? So that is an example of mushroom. Okay, and again, that's just a brief kind of big picture view, but there's a lot of different things that we can do with mushrooms depending on whether they're a saprobe or some sort of symbiont with a tree that we're interested in. I'm going to move into another plant. In this case, this is called a leek or a ramp. Maybe some of you have heard of this. This is a wild onion that occurs here in the eastern United States and the Midwestern United States on forest lands. It typically comes up in the springtime and produces the leaves, as you can see before the canopy has leafed out. It's considered one of our most cherished delicacies here on the East Coast, and it has grown extensively in popularity in the last, let's say, 2 decades, to the point that we are now facing some conservation concerns around it. And so this gets into the functionality of forest farming a lot of the time, which is to say, if we have a plant or a mushroom or some type of crop that we are interested in, and we know that there's some conservation need around the species, forest farming is, the way that we can get that conservation and actually use the product as well. So, we can use it as a vehicle, if you will, to conservation. So this is a crop that, as I mentioned, kind of a wild onion relative. It's in the same genus, Allium, as garlic and onions. I know from, again, having lived out in Idaho, that there are many wild onions out in the Pacific Northwest. And perhaps you all have some wild onions that occur on your forest lands that you already enjoy. And that would be the first step, right, in thinking about forest farming, is if there are wild onions that are found on your property, who are they and how do you get more of them, right? And so here in the case of ramps or wild leek is a case study. Ramps come in 2 different color morphs. It's the same species, but there's a lot of controversy, if you will, out there about flavor profile and so on. It's another story. Distribution of this species is not the Pacific Northwest. It's decidedly here in the East and Midwest, and fairly extensively so. It has grown in popularity, as I mentioned, so we have gone from simply a forage product to something that is in demand in all of the urban environments. Here in Pennsylvania, I have a lot of East Coast large cities about 4 hours away, including Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York. And many of the ramps and ramp growers here in the state of Pennsylvania are shipping into those markets. Here's an example of ramps being sold in Pittsburgh. We have a variety of different value-added products that people are developing out of ramps as this demand and this kind of fever has grown. Here are just some products that provide some examples of what people are doing with ramps here in Pennsylvania. We have, of course, mustards and dips, and here we have a leek vodka, which may not sound very good, and to my taste buds wasn't very good. I hate to say it, but they tell me it's very good in a Bloody Mary, so I could see that that might be true. So when we talk about ramps or wild leeks, many onions in North America, including many Northwestern onions, actually fall into a category we call multiplier onions. So they divide over time, like chives do in the garden, right? Like garlic does. So you plant one and they divide over time. Ramps fall into that category. They're just much slower at it. So one of our conservation concerns is the fact that from seed we get 5 to 7 years before we can get something that's harvestable typically. From transplant, maybe 3 to 5 years. Okay, so they divide every few years, perhaps, depending on the growing site. We can use that first and foremost to our advantage. For example, on the right side, we have 2 ramps that came from one on the same basal plate. One of those can be harvested and the other one can be planted right back in the hole where we harvested from, right? So thinking about the stewardship angle, the propagation, the horticulture. Here's how ramps grow. Over time, they typically divide and we end up with what looks like a little donut, right? So getting to know what these plants look like, how they grow, how to manage them, how to harvest them. In this case, ramps, as I just mentioned, will grow into this kind of small clump that then can be divided. And here we can take little propagules off of the basal plants and start moving them around in the forest, okay, as such. So, part of doing forest farming is thinking about where does the plant material come from. Yeah, you all could, maybe be interested when we're done here tonight in some of these crops. Ginseng. Are people in Oregon growing American ginseng? There are people actually growing American ginseng, actually. But where do you get the planting stock from, right? And that is the perennial question, pun intended, I guess. With a lot of agroforestry and forest farming is when you're thinking about plant material, where do you get it from? Many of these things are wild plants, and in many cases, we're interested in genetic provenance. That is where it comes from. We want it to be as regional or local as possible. So again, if you start working with the plants that are already found on your property, as a principle, things that are already there, I'm going to start to manage and divide and propagate those. You're well ahead of the game, and some of those heady issues go away, and also some of the costs associated with obtaining this planting material. So for example, wild leek bulbs or ramp bulbs right now, if you were to go on to some of the vendors that are selling it, they can go upwards of $3 to $5 a plant. If you were going to try and grow this and sell it into the Eastern markets here, just as an example, we're looking at, as you saw on the one slide, $15 a pound. So, that pound is going to take, maybe 20 plants. So you're losing money if you're paying $5 a plant to stick it in the ground and babysit it for a few years, only to bundle it up and sell it in an urban market at a loss, right? So where do you get that planting stock? You try and get it as local as possible. And by local, we mean plants that are growing on your property, or maybe you can barter with neighbors or friends or community members. And then you start to think about how you can replicate what you're seeing in those wild populations. And so in this case, this is an example of growers posting on Facebook their experimentation with planting outside of the forest in their backyard. As it turns out, ramps are fully capable of growing in full sunlight because they photosynthesize in the full sunlight of the early spring. It's just that they can't compete in the seedling stage in those open conditions. So that's why they're on forest lands, but you can grow them outside of forest lands if you take care of them. Okay. And so, one of the things associated with ramps, for example, is that you can actually grow it outside of forest lands, but it's limited in terms of its ability to grow in those sites because of soil moisture. So just like many wild alliums, the roots are shallow. And, if you're growing garlic or onions, you have to put drip irrigation or something on them if you're in an arid environment or an area that's not getting, consistent moisture. And so ramps, as it turns out, are very similar, and many alliums are, in that they are very shallowly rooted, and where they show up in the landscape is often a reflection more of a moisture preference than it is sunlight or nutrient availability. So one of the things we think about in forest farming is, again, the holistic perspective. It's not just about matching up your plant to a soil test result. It's about observing Mother Nature and seeing how these plants and where they grow, and then trying to replicate those conditions. Here is what ramps do, by the way, by the time the leaves come out in the springtime. This is just mid-May for us here in the Eastern United States. The ramps are already yellowing up and dying back. And so this is what they look like around Memorial Day. And then in midsummer, they're back. They produce flowers. And then those flowers produce these green fruits, which mature in the late summer and fall into these things that have black seeds. And so the other part that I always have to remind some of the ramp aficionados that occur throughout the eastern, United States here in Pennsylvania is that ramp season does not end in the springtime. It ends at the end of the full growing season. So again, the intentionality part of forest farming rears its head here. The idea is that it's not enough to go out in the springtime and just restrain your harvest and say, oh, I'm only going to take 20% from the patch, and that's forest farming. The idea is that we go back out to that patch in the case of ramps, late summer and early fall, and we're gathering those propagules and we're spreading those seeds around and we're getting seedling recruitment as well as bulb transplants going in landscape, right? And so it's following through on those commitments, just like we would in farming, to make sure that seed is getting in the ground. Okay, and that means for us here, ramp season is seed gathering season is right now, all the way through the fall months. Just maturing those seeds as they mature, gathering them and putting them underneath the leaves. Okay. One of the reasons we're interested in that practice alone is that for many of the plants that we're interested in, not just here in the Eastern United States, but also for many of the genera that I'm familiar with that also occur in the Pacific Northwest, we've got some very sensitive kind of seed stratification requirements for a lot of these plants. They're not just your garden tomato, if you will. And they're very finicky and tricky to germinate. So oftentimes we're trying to make sure that at the very least that they're getting into the mineral soil, right? That we're making sure that they get below predation and below desiccation and into the mineral soil where they can germinate and hopefully find success. So again, just planting seeds is an act of forest farming. Okay, and here's what ramps look like then as they're coming up in the springtime after we've seeded in. And that's pulling away the leaves, right? This is all happening underneath the leaves. Okay. So ramps will take multiple years to grow. One of the reasons that we're interested in many of these forest farm crops, and ramps illustrate this, again, part of this crop visit, if you will, that we're doing is to kind of illustrate some of the complexities we run into in forest farming. And one of the complexities is that these crops often take multiple years to develop. So on the left, we have a seed that's germinating. On the right, we have a mature bulb. In ramps, that's at least 3 years. And in many cases, as I said earlier, 5 to 7 years. And so oftentimes the things that we're choosing to grow on these forest lands don't just grow well on forest lands, aren't just shade obligate, but actually they're better handled on forest lands because of the length of time that it takes to produce them. If you had to put up artificial shade and maintain that for 6 years, for example, that's a huge cost, a huge infrastructure. Okay. Here's ramps then starting as a small patch and with a little bit of TLC and a few years of effort, growing into a large patch. And that's just a slight exaggeration. These are not the same site, but that just shows you what is possible, right? So these are both areas that are being managed. In this case, this is a landowner that's just starting out with one plant that has been spreading, and he has been spreading. In this case, this is a landowner that has been managing and spreading for many years. And this is what the ramp patch looks like, or at least a part of it. And so when you have a patch like this, we can start thinking about commercial foraging, right? And that is what we want to forest farm for, right? So if you're interested in really going down the rabbit hole of forest farming and really managing native crops in the understory, a large reason or a large drive for that would be because you're trying to get into some sort of commercial angle. In this case, a commercial ramp growing angle. Okay, this as well. This producer actually sells into the city of Pittsburgh. Okay, so final, as we round the bend, final crop I'm going to talk about tonight is a medicinal crop. This is American ginseng. It will illustrate several other kind of principles that we want to think about in forest farming. Recognize American ginseng is an important worldwide medicinal plant. It comes from the Eastern United States and Midwestern United States, as do ramps. Incidentally, as I'll talk more about with site selection in just a moment, and ginseng, Both ramps and ginseng grow with sugar maple, and so they can be grown on the same site, but at a different moisture position, if you will. So ramps like it moister than ginseng. So lower on the slope, we grow ramps. Higher on the slope, we grow ginseng, right? So we're paying attention to where things like to grow. So here is the distribution of American ginseng in the eastern United States. It is a heavily exploited plant for international commerce. It's got a really valuable root associated with it. Again, we do webinars on this. If you're interested, you can feel free to reach out to me. I can send you some recordings. But we're looking at anywhere from $300 to $3,000 really a pound for high quality wild root. And cultivated root is on the right side of the screen here. That is illustrated with a very different product, different appearing product that sells for much less value. And so there continues to be this interest in growing ginseng that looks wild on forest lands, while we're facing this conservation challenge associated with overexploitation of wild ginseng here in eastern United States. So it has presented and continues to present a great opportunity for landowners to not only conserve a species, but also to grow a highly valuable species with a minimum of inputs on forest lands. So, to preface the whole thing, this is how most of the world's ginseng is produced. This is Ontario, Canada, one of the hubs in North America of ginseng production. And because of the shade obligate requirements of ginseng, they have to put up artificial shade, as you can see here. This is creating about 60% shade, in case you're wondering. So, the idea, once again, going back to the beginning, is that in many cases we're picking crops that like to grow in the shade or require shade, thereby eliminating the costs associated with putting up this kind of infrastructure. In the case of American ginseng, we can use tree canopies, but not just any canopies, as I'll share more about in just a moment. And we can grow the plant in the forest understory as a medicinal plant, get those wild characteristics that the market is looking for, and sell into the wild market and get those prices that the wild market is paying versus the cultivated. So with ginseng, what I want to do is illustrate a little bit about site selection and thinking through site selection in forest farming. It's a very important element, and it involves really kind of an interest in forest ecology or getting to know your forest land. So I'm going to draw on, and again, if people are interested in some of this, you can feel free to reach out to me. Happy to send you this paper, for example, published about 10 years ago, 11 years ago, looking at where the good sites are to grow a plant like ginseng. So one of the things we want to think about in forest farming is, remember, we're starting with that low-hanging fruit. And with that low-hanging fruit, we're looking for what's already there. And we're going to manage that. But what if we want to grow something, for example, ginseng, which was maybe there but is no longer there because someone maybe already over-harvested it, or it's just not there, and we want to do some assisted migration, right? We want to try and move something new in there. It's on my neighbor's property and it'll grow just fine here. Start your own patch, if you will, or as I say, plant your own patch. Well, you got to think about, where does it grow? So the first thing I would say, without getting into the science of it, is a lot of the work we do around this is just looking at where it already grows, right? And quantifying that habitat. And so that's what's illustrated here and what I'll be talking a little bit about in the next few slides. But you can do this without, quantifying. Just pay attention to where things grow. So if there's a particular plant that grows on, a state park or a state national forest land or something like that, or a mushroom, who's it growing with, right? Where is it growing? And then do you have a similar type of habitat, right? Is there a spot, what we call a honey hole or a sweet spot, that you could actually introduce it to? And it need not be a large area unless it's going to be something that you're interested in expanding into commercial territory with. Okay. And so, for example, ginseng in the eastern United States is associated heavily with sugar maple. Sugar maple is associated with some of our best site conditions, the most abundant limestone and calcium content, for example, the most mesic sites, not too wet, not too dry. Okay, sugar maple in turn has its own products. And so this is where we get into that vertical integration that we were talking about at the beginning. In the case of sugar maple, We get a timber value. We call that hard maple in the Eastern United States. It's our most valuable maple from a wood production standpoint. But as you can see here, it's also the main species that furnishes maple syrup here in the Eastern United States. So this is a bucket producer here in central Pennsylvania, producing, on about a 900 bucket operation. And this area is perfectly suitable to grow ginseng in the understory, right? And so we can grow things that are perennial, slow-growing crops in the forest understory. And as long as we're not creating massive disturbance to that forest floor, in this case, the forest floor is typically frozen whenever these buckets are being emptied. And once it starts to thaw out, they're oftentimes being pulled. As long as we're being cognizant of what's happening and the trampling and the traffic and that sort of stuff on the forest understory, then we can go ahead and do something with that vertical infrastructure. And here, you could be thinking big leaf maple. Tubing operations can help with this as well. So I'm not sure to what extent big leaf maple actually is being hooked up to tubing operations in the Pacific Northwest, but here in the Eastern United States, tubing removes the traffic off of the forest floor, and so we can have the sap come to us. Okay. Other species like white ash, which were formerly very important. My understanding is you all just now had the first detection of emerald ash borer out in Oregon, affecting Oregon ash. We've had it here for about 15 years. It has pretty much decimated all of our white ash. And so that has changed the composition of what we're looking for. But other trees include things like basswood, tulip poplar. So the idea here is, again, you need not have this kind of scientific data, but you're paying attention to the species that tend to go in association with the species you're interested in growing in the understory, right? Because what we're getting at here is that those trees are both long-term barometers of the proper site conditions for growing that particular plant or mushroom. Okay, so it reflects, in other words, the right conditions, but it also is modifying those conditions, and it's making it more and more conducive in some cases to the species of interest in the understory. So in the case of ginseng, ginseng actually likes abundant calcium, and the trees that it grows with then are well known for having high calcium content. And calcium is one of the few nutrients that at the end of the growing season is not pulled back from the leaves. And so it actually is dropped off, if you will, as an annual fertilizer in the form of leaf mulch, and fertilizes the ginseng. So it's no accident then that ginseng tends to occur with trees like basswood, tulip poplar, white ash, and sugar maple, which provide the right amount of calcium as well as, the proper rate of decomposition of leaf litter. Okay. In the understory, we also look for plants. So here in the Eastern United States, again, this may not mean anything, but just to give you an example, looking for the right type of ferns, in this case, rattlesnake fern, which has a history of being known in the Eastern United States of being an indicator for ginseng. Okay. And then we can decide what we're going to do with these crops, right? So once we have the site picked out, we can start to decide what the scale of introduction is going to be. In this case, we have an intensive grower that's making beds. This is what we call the woods cultivated approach on that spectrum that I showed you earlier. Okay, it's illustrated by a grower, for example, in Western Maryland by the name of Larry Harding, illustrating it here. Beds are easy to manage and they can be productive. The problem is when we start to push these plants like ginseng, in beds using horticultural techniques, sometimes we get diseases. Diseases then become another management issue that we have to pay attention to. So, the more that we start to do intensive production, the more sometimes we are inviting challenges. And that's just one of the principles to think about in forest farming is there is that Goldilocks zone that we want to try and achieve, where we're maintaining biodiversity in that forest and we're still getting increased productivity out of it through vertical integration and species composition. Many diseases can affect ginseng, for example, Phytophthora and Alternaria. So one of the ways that we do this is by maintaining, remember I said earlier in the presentation, instead of going with monocultures in the understory, we try and maintain companions or polycultural guilds. That is, we're trying to maintain some of the natural vegetation that's already there. and we are not necessarily trying to grow monocultures of ginseng, for example. And so I'm going to show you in the remainder of this presentation a little bit what this looks like. So bear with me, I just have a few more slides. If you try and grow ginseng in an intensive fashion like this, oftentimes we end up with critters, in this case, voles, right? So the more that we push the plants, ginseng as an example, the more that we are inviting the same types of horticultural and agricultural kinds of pests and pastorants that we deal with in monocultural cropping. So even though these guys don't look necessarily the part, they're some of the finest forest farmers that I work with here in the Eastern United States. They may not have a good taste in beer, but we'll give them a pass on that. This is Cliff and Randy, and I'm just going to, in the remaining moments, walk you through an example of what a good, balanced ginseng farm looks like according to these principles. And so first of all, we go in, we identify the trees that we're going to keep in the overstory, and we're thinking about any kind of thinning and using that slash for the appropriate purposes. In this case, these gentlemen are not interested in growing mushrooms, but instead are laying it down on the ground that they are seeding in with ginseng seeds. That slash then protects the plants from deer and turkeys who would otherwise eat the plants and scratch out the seeds. It also decomposes and thereby returns organic matter and nutrients back to the soil. The ginseng does not really mind it at all, and as you can see in this picture, is growing fine in the understory of this thin little slash, and is protected from any predation, right, that might happen. And for us in the East, it's deer, white-tailed deer. They even reproduce under there, and so there's a wad of red berries producing seeds that can be gathered and planted. Okay, so again, intentionality here in ginseng is just taking those seeds and putting them back. We get those seeds put in the ground, we get more ginseng plants. Those ginseng plants, again, are being grown up through the slash in organic matter that's being recycled into the forest floor. And in the process of doing that, we're also starting to think about the future forest, selecting for appropriate trees that we want to be representative canopy trees. In this case, at about 11 o'clock, we have a tulip poplar tree that is being managed for. Right? And we may not see the monoculture that we're looking for when we look out here. For example, we're seeing all rubus species or blackberries in this case, but underneath those blackberries are ginseng plants. Okay, and you can just get a sense of how many plants there are. In this picture, those gentlemen are bent over in a patch of rubus and a few other ferns and things. All that yellow that you see in there are ginseng plants. And here's a closer shot of it. So the idea is we're managing an intensive way these ginseng plants to grow in this polycultural understory. And at this point, removing things like invasive shrubs and so on that we don't want in there, but otherwise just managing the population that has been established from seed. And so the whole idea, kind of comes full circle. So with that, I don't know if we have time for questions. I think we have maybe a little bit of time. I'm happy to kind of open it up to any questions or further dives that people want to do with any of the content that I have presented tonight. But again, the idea is to just kind of wet your whistle, give you a little introduction to what forest farming is and some of the opportunities and some of the things to think about, and hopefully maybe inspire you to walk around your forest land and take a good look.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, you have about 25 minutes if you would like to take it, or we can also depart early. So we'll give folks an option. If you would like to ask any clarifying questions or comments, you are welcome to unmute yourself, or if you feel more comfortable, add them into the chat, and I'd be happy to read them off. So I see some thank yous for you, Eric. I'm sure you can see the chat as well.
Yeah, so I'll mention for those who might have any questions or still getting their brain wrapped around it, Patrick Schultz, who jumped off with WSU Extension, who was on here. He is actually a co-author of a pub that we have coming out, hopefully in 2025 is the plan, that Janine was a part of as well. National Agroforestry is putting out a agroforestry manual for all of the 5 practices, and the bulk of the manual will be around the woody plant selection. So it'll be a guide to all of the woody plants that are currently popular and used in different forest farming and agroforestry practices around the United States, and then a little bit about the state of the art of each practice. So I was the lead author on the forest farming practice, and Patrick was a co-author on that chapter. So he brought in some Pacific Northwest content into that chapter. So that should be out in 2025 as a resource for the general public. It will be national in scope, and Patrick, who was here, was part of that. So stay tuned.
I see more thank yous for you. And then there is a question. Let's see if from Jens Johnson. In my forest, I have elderberry and Oregon grape, etc. Also plants used by indigenous peoples, particularly roots.
Right.
How do I encourage these and find markets?
Yeah, great question. So I would say with all agroforestry, but certainly with forest farming, because of the scope of what's available to us, the bio richness that we have available to us across North America on forest lands, um, it becomes challenging to figure out, well, is there really a market for this stuff? And how do I find that market? And that is in and of itself a whole nother webinar. In fact, as I shared at the beginning of the presentation, it's a webinar in November, because it is a challenging part of this if there isn't already a market there. So let me just say this. All of the things that I went through tonight, morels, ramps, ginseng, these are all crops that, whether you're aware of it or not, here in the East, there is no shortage of people who want to buy them. So even though it's not like you go down to the local grocery store or farmer's market and see ginseng for sale, there are people that right now is ginseng season here in Pennsylvania, and so there is no shortage of people all over social media and stuff looking to buy it. Same thing with ramps. Come ramp season, thanks to social media, for better or for worse, there are people that are just looking to source ramps from all the urban markets. So one of the things that I can say is that things continue to evolve. And I don't know what I don't know. And the same thing is true with you, that if you start looking around on social media, Facebook, for example, you'll often find that there are groups that you never knew existed. Oh, you mean some people actually harvest that and make something out of it, right? Kind of thing. So you really just need to do your homework, first of all, in anything that you have on forest lands that you're particularly drawn to or interested in developing beyond personal use. So in the case of elderberry, I know that you all have at least a couple of different elderberries out there. I'm guessing you might be talking about the red elderberry, but there's also the blue elderberry, right? Cerulean. In either case, I'm not aware, but I'm not in your local market, that there's a huge market for either of those elderberries. Unlike here in the Eastern United States, the black elderberry or Eastern elderberry is very closely related to the European elderberry, and so is often lumped together in that same medicinal market and juice market. So it continues to grow as a formalized market that you can sell into. In states like Pennsylvania, people are looking increasingly for more and more elderberry. So what I would say is, for some of these things like elderberry, you have to do your homework and just see where people are at, who's doing what. And there may not be a well-developed formal market for some of these things, period. There may be no well-developed market, but you have an opportunity to step in and fill that niche. Okay. Or you may actually find out that while there's not an evident market at the local farmers market that you go to, if you look online a little bit, there are some actual channels to sell this stuff through, right? So that's all a little bit of a long-winded way of saying you got to kind of investigate for some of these crops. For something like Oregon grapefruit, it's a little bit different only insofar that there are some more formalized markets associated with the medicinal uses of that plant. So for example, I know that Mountain Rose Herbs, for example, buys that. And they have had long-standing relationships, because I'd worked with their buyers as well, with people who are wild harvesters and stewards of that particular plant in Oregon, maybe even Washington as well, for sourcing it. So, in some cases, many of these herbs, this is a big project that we're working on here in the Eastern United States, is they're probably going to continue to come from the wild. And it really just takes people who want to do this kind of intensive, what we're calling forest farming, but let's call it also foraging and stewardship, to do that and to work with a company to make sure that you're doing it in a responsible way. So there are plenty of niches like that out there still.
Thank you, Eric. I see Janine is also adding in some resources for folks
Yeah.
to the chat. Do folks have any other questions for Eric? Give folks that abnormally awkward wait time.
Sure.
Anyone would like to unmute themselves or turn on their video to ask a question, you are more than welcome to do that as well.
I see there's a question around incorporating good fire into forest farming. So that's an area that I'm reluctant to wade into, only because I know that fire it can be tricky, and it's local in terms of how one manages fire, right? So here in the Eastern United States, we don't have the same types of fires that you all tend to have. But let me just say this, just some broader principles, which is I think all you're asking for, is we do know from First Nations indigenous management practices on the West Coast, but also here in the Midwest, and historical accounts from places like Pennsylvania, that fire was a regular part of many landscapes, right, as a management tool. The intensity then has kind of ramped up, if you will. And you all are probably aware of this. A large part of it is due to things like climate change, but also a large part of it is fuel buildup. That is a long period of time of fire suppression that has allowed for a lot of fuel to build up. And so when a fire does go through, it burns really hot and it causes these catastrophic fires. So regular fire cycles are arguably needed in many parts of North America again, to kind of restore that balance, getting away from catastrophic canopy fires for many forest types, but also to improve the quality, not just the quantity and composition, but the quality of the things that occur. So for example, nut crops and fruit crops in the understory. So some of the more compelling information I've seen blending traditional ecological knowledge with some scientific investigation has come from places like Northern California with some of the tribes, where they're looking at huckleberry management in forest understories and how fire has improved the quality, not just the productivity of the plants, but the quality of what you get. When you get fire, you get kind of a thinning of a lot of dead wood. And you get opening up of the canopies of those shrubs and things of that nature that allows for better air circulation and so on, light penetration. And so, it's just something we want to think about, that some things are not just measured about how many dollars that we're getting from it, or how many, improved yields measures, or whatever, bushels, right? Whatever we might be measuring it by. It really is about like the quality and the health of things as well. And so when we think about fire as a tool in forest farming, it should be approached within the context of, well, where does fire fit in with the overall ecology of where you're at in North America? What was the typical fire cycle? What does indigenous knowledge have to tell us about that cycle and management of these resources? Maybe why they're declining or less common these days. And so in case that wasn't clear, maybe I'll just say this, that, the whole practice of forest farming, that's just a new name for really a very old practice. which is, this idea that we manage forest lands as every bit as intensively as we would an agronomic field, if not more intensively. And we think about the entire forested ecosystem holistically, managing it, for not just longer term returns associated with some of the tree species, but maybe more near-term returns associated with fruit that we want to consume or medicinal crops that we want to sell and so on. So the idea here is really to take us away from this mentality that we often can get ourselves boxed into, where we're just so hyper-focused on one thing and one thing only. In some cases, it's maybe just a high-value tree. In some cases, it's maybe just the forest and not the understory. In some cases, maybe it's just the understory and not paying attention to what's going on in the canopy. So I, in that regard, call forest farming a bit of a gateway drug, if you will, because it kind of draws you into thinking about all these rabbit holes of things that maybe you hadn't really paid attention to and thought about. Suggested resources to learn how indigenous peoples may have forest farmed edible plants we now find growing wild in Oregon. So one of the best books that I would suggest, there's actually two, and let me see if I can just quickly locate them on my bookshelf. There they are. And I'll show them. Oop. So you all have to recognize that, unfortunately, because of how indigenous knowledge was not valued early on, much of it was erased before we got a chance to document it. So we have a very skewed kind of version of how landscapes were managed. That said, we do have some good, I would say, academic kind of works that have been produced. So one of them is a book by Kat Anderson called Tending the Wild. It is based on management in California of wild crops and wild resources. And all I can say is it will blow your mind. The amount of knowledge and wisdom and influence that Native peoples had on that landscape, and some of the ways that that it was unfortunately taken away from them by manipulating their management of those resources. It's just a very, very deep kind of read, and will really open your eyes and your mind to the possibilities of what it means to just kind of tend something, right? To take care of something for a resource, especially for a perennial resource. Another book that is more specific to the Pacific Northwest is a book called Keeping It Living, which is more of an anthropological treatise, but is still very valuable. One of the co-authors or editors on it is Nancy Turner, who many of you probably know, a very prominent ethnobotanist based out of your region, who has been working with the tribes up there. And so this book is definitely more on the academic. They're both academic, but this one is a lot more kind of chapters summarizing usages and so on. And so it is academic in nature, but again, it's very useful to just kind of wrap your brain around what we know and how we know it and what we don't know, right? And what we do know, getting back to our point, is that the simple act of intention around managing wild resources around us, getting to know them, following where they grow and where they grow well, and then managing them in those areas, dividing things like rhizomes and spreading them to help them kind of conquer more area, if you will. These are all part of a strategy that goes back way back into pre-written history, if you will.
Excellent, thank you. I'm just reflecting on how much we can get from forested lands that we already have on our properties, and one of our previous presentations on silvopasture, like going into tending animals and within our forested already lands without having to change them as much. And now with your presentation of foraging and farming those lands, I'm wondering, a question came up in my mind seeing some of your examples, focusing on one crop. Do you find that folks will do that kind of monoculture approach for efficiency, or do folks typically farm multiple species on their property, or does it just kind of depend on what they have resources available, or their market? Is it
Yeah.
complicated, or do folks tend to focus on one?
Um, so that's a great question. I think people get interested in forest farming based on a species that they're interested in, whether it's like a gateway mushroom or a gateway ginseng plant or whatever, right? They become interested in it, and then they start to learn a little bit more about the community that that plant is a part of and some of the other things that tend to show up. And then all of a sudden now I'm interested in more than just ginseng or morels, right? I'm interested in these other things that tend to associate. And so that's where the gateway drug analogy or metaphor comes in there. So, the way that people tend to approach it often is like this monocultural thought process where it's like, oh, I'm interested. I found a ginseng plant. I want to figure out how I can grow acres of ginseng because it's worth a lot of money. And then they go out onto their forest land and they start to pay attention to things and they start to scale, in many cases, those dreams back a little bit and realize that it's a very complicated kind of onion that we have to kind of peel back here. And so what ends up happening, I think, for many people, there are a few exceptions, is that the ambition is to do something along the lines of monoculture, or maybe if
Are you still there, Eric?
in succession and vegetation changing over time. It's going to, right? It's always going to be changing in one way or another. Maybe the trees are going to stay the same, but maybe one tree falls down and a gap is created, and now we've got an understory that's starting to move in a different direction, right? So there's always change that's happening, and there's an analogy out there that I'll mess up, or a saying out there, but I'll just kind of paraphrase here by saying that we're kind of just adjusting our sails, right? Along the way. We're just kind of not necessarily sure of where we're going, but as the winds kind of change direction, we're kind of adjusting our sails with the wind and recognizing like what the wind is bringing us. And in this case, it's like, okay, well, the overstory composition has been changing on my property over the last 50 years. It's moving away from this and it's going towards this. What help me understand this, first of all, right? So that's where you need the advice of a forester, perhaps, to kind of help you untangle, like, is that natural, or is there an invasive species that's causing that, or what's going on there, right? Before you can start to disentangle, how do I start managing that? If it's moving towards a monoculture, is there a reason for that in the overstory, and do I want to start to diversify that, right? So these things, as a principle, polyculture is what we want to do, but these things kind of have a trajectory of their own, and we're just kind of trying to pay attention to where things move and adjust it, if you will. And that means by in the understory, if a species that you found desirable 10 years ago is starting to spread all over the place and it's starting to outcompete another desirable species, well, then you might start to take some aggressive action against that species, even if it's native, right, and desirable. You might over harvest it from an area, right? We do this all the time. I do it on my property, right? Right now, I've got an abundance of goldenrod that's taking over beds that I do not want it to take over, right? So at some point, you have to get in there and you have to thin it out. And so that's the idea, is if left to their own devices, communities will go in their own directions. Sometimes that's towards a monoculture, sometimes it's away. And, we steer the ship in the direction that we think is a good direction based on a lot of the personal values that we hold and the ecological kinds of baseline conditions we're trying to match.
Excellent, thank you. I see more thank yous in the chat, and those resources are great. I will include them in our follow-up email. And the PDF that you sent me, I can send that along to our registrants, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Wonderful. Excellent. Are there any last questions from folks? Thank you.
Hey, thanks everybody.
Thank you so much. It was a late evening for you. We really appreciate your time and your knowledge, and we hope to have you for another presentation another time.
Sure.
Have a
Anytime.
have a great evening.
You too.
All right. Thank
Take
you,
care, everybody.
everyone.